All right. Well, if you are kind of getting situated, we're going to actually be in the book of John today. Book of John, chapter 6, New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the fourth one in the Gospels. I hope that when you came in, you got a bulletin, a menu, what's on for today. So also just the monthly announcements actually, and just remind you of the Body Life services that'll be coming up on the 29th of June, July 27th. Those are the ones that are on the calendar for now. We're going to try to set those at a regular time, probably the last Sunday night of the month. These are going to be special services for your church family to come together, minister to one another. I love it when there's a prophetic word given on a Sunday morning where I'm just needing a prophetic word, needing to hear from God. That's what you heard here today as Leonard goes forth. And, Leonard talks anyway. We love him. But when he waxes eloquent under the Spirit, it's a whole nother dimension, right? And so when it's the Spirit of the God moving through him and encouraging your heart with a word from him, it's just a special thing. And God does it in a number of ways with different people. Usually when I give a prophetic word, it's more like, I think maybe God might be saying something to somebody here. I know it's not quite as eloquent, but, God still gets the job done. So we receive that word. Don't y'all receive the word this morning that's already been given? And, it's really important when God speaks to you that you acknowledge that he's speaking to you, and whether it's thank you, I receive that, work on me with it, God. Receive that word and just receive it with some kind of action of your own. Part of our problem in church is we've been sitting and watching way too long. And things bounce off of us. And we need to receive and actuate what God gives us, activate it in our life. So anyway, that's part of what we're going to do on Body Life nights. We're going to have just a time of worship together, time for words, whatever the Lord may be speaking to us in those times, kind of a little bit more time to just be ourselves with each other. And then also some training and some vision casting, depending on what God's saying to us on any given month. Now, this first month of June, it's June 1st, and I'm going to have to remember that. June 1st today, at the end of this month, our training is just going to be on hospitality and then ushers and greeters. And even if you're not an usher and greeter, you need to know today that you're an important person. How many of y'all been here more than once? Well, welcome to your church. So nobody else, I just want you to think about this. Think about it. If a first-time person comes through the door, they don't know that you've only been here twice. So welcome home. You're part of the bunch now. Now it's up to you to hug them and make them feel welcome or show them around, because it doesn't take long. Bathrooms, coffee bar, come sit down, right? We can get that. So y'all can help with that. And that's just part of it, is that hospitality. Have you ever been to a church and people didn't say hey, didn't say hi, didn't show you around? You didn't like it either. Come back, I'll get better. So just anyway, that's part of what we're going to learn. Just working together just to love people. Is that all right? So that's what we're going to do this end of the month. Now, to start this off this morning, I thought I would be real spiritual. You might be in a redneck church if. Any rednecks in the bunch this morning? I talk like this, but I'm not a redneck. I do not listen to country music, and it's not four-wheel drive on my truck. But I do have a dog, and I do have lots of guns. I don't know what that means. Got lots of guns and things like that. Anyway, you're in a redneck church when the pastor says, I'd like to ask Bubba to help us take up the offering, and 5 guys and 2 women stand up. You're in a redneck church if a member of the church requests to be buried in his four-wheel drive truck because it ain't ever been in a hole he couldn't get him out of. You're in a redneck church if the choir is known as the OK Corral. Okay, it's getting dimmer. I guess it's kind of like the sermon. Start off slow and then go downhill all together, I guess. So, you're in a redneck church if in a congregation of 500 members there are only 7 last names in the church directory. You're in a redneck church if people think rapture is what you get when you lift something too heavy. Y'all having fun yet? You're in a redneck church if the choir robes were donated and embroidered with the logo from Billy Bob's Barbecue. You're in a redneck church if the collection plates are really hubcaps from a 56 Chevy. You're in a redneck church if instead of a bell, you're called to service by a duck call. There's some Duck Dynasty people out there. I've seen you. I've seen y'all around. You'd grow that beard if you thought you'd get away with it. You know you're in a redneck church if the minister and his wife drive matching pickup trucks. See? They're not matching, but they are pickup trucks. You know you're in a redneck church if thou shalt not covet also applies to hunting dogs. You know you're in a redneck church if the final words of the benediction are, y'all come back now, you hear? And then finally, this actually does tie into the sermon today, I promise. You know you're in a redneck church if people ask when they learn that Jesus fed the 5,000 whether the 2 fish were bass or catfish and what bait was used to catch them. We're looking at the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Quite frankly, it's one of my favorite Bible stories. It's one of my favorite miracles that Jesus did. As a matter of fact, it must have really stood out in the disciples' minds too, because it is one of the few miracles that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. I happen to pick John today, John 6, but you could go back in Mark, Matthew, Luke. Each of those will have their own take on it, their own account of it. We're going to kind of make reference in a couple of places today. So you can study that on your own and kind of cross-reference. It'll tell you there if you've got a study Bible where those other passages are. But each gospel carries this miracle, and not all of the other miracles are like that. So I love this one. Plus, it has to do with the little boy and his fishes and loaves. Have y'all ever just felt pretty pitiful? Like what you got just doesn't matter too much? What you've done hasn't mattered too much? You don't have much to offer God? Can you imagine? A little kid, man, we got 5,000 people. We got a couple of loaves and fishes. And Long John Silver's hadn't even put the toy in yet. And this is what we're offering. You know, can you just imagine? So I really identify with him. And I just want to also say this. I identify with this. In our lives, we've had times of great blessing and plenty. In our lives, we've had times of opposite. Testing, struggle, where, you know, check ran out before month. Have y'all ever been there? Things like that where you struggle and those kinds of things. We just made up our minds, though, when we got married, and we were young when we were married. She was 19, I was 22, and starting off, we were making a lot of money. Our first parsonage, I love the folks. They were awesome people, and they gave us what they could afford. In our first parsonage, our pastime was to watch the wind blow through the curtains with the windows closed. You know, this is the way we started. Right, Mona? Remember, my mother-in-law came and said, oh, dear, what is my... Look what he's brought her. The palace. And our joke was always, honey, if you hadn't married me, you'd have missed all this. So we've been in those times where it just... And it wasn't just then either. It's through the years, you know, surgeries and stuff and school and things where we struggle. And the real test is always this. Who are you going to trust? Who are you going to trust? Every time we run into those places where what I need is not there, and I'm not just talking about finance, I'm talking about stuff, encouragement, and things like that. Who are you going to trust? And I just ask you this morning, have you ever in your life faced a need that just you didn't know how you're going to provide for it? You didn't know how God was going to provide for it. It just didn't know where to look for trust. Maybe you've read this on Facebook. It's a story of a lady that actually went to spend some time with her husband's boss. That they as a couple had went to spend time with their family, and his boss was mega rich, you know, just rich guy. And so they spent this time, and she was a little bit nervous about it, but they spent that weekend. And here's how I just want to read this. It's kind of in a short story. I just real briefly. She says her friend Arlene was really nervous about that weekend. The boss was very wealthy with a fine home on the waterway and cars costing more than their house cost. The first day and evening went well, and Arlene was delighted to have this rare glimpse into how the very wealthy live. The husband's employer was quite generous as a host and took them to the finest restaurants. Arlene knew she would never have the opportunity to indulge in this kind of extravagance again, so she was really enjoying herself. Have many of y'all ever go and you think, well, I think this guy can afford it. I think I am going to get that steak that I always ignore. So this is what she was doing, right? As the three of them were about to go into an exclusive restaurant that evening, the boss was walking slightly ahead of Arlene and her husband. He stopped suddenly, looking down on the pavement for a long, silent moment. Arlene wondered whether they were supposed to pass him. There was nothing on the ground except a single darkened penny that someone had dropped and a few cigarette butts. Still silent, the man reached down and picked up the penny. He held it up and smiled, put it in his pocket as if he had found a great treasure. How absurd, she thought. What would this man need a single penny for? Why would he even take the time to stop and pick it up? Throughout the dinner, the entire scene just continued to nag on her and nag on her. She wondered what was up. Finally, she couldn't stand any longer, and she casually mentioned that her daughter had a coin collection, and she asked if the penny he picked up might have some significant value that she couldn't tell. A smile crept across the man's face as he reached into his pocket for the penny and held it up for her to see. She had seen many pennies before. What was the point of this one? He said, look at it. Read what it says. And she says, United States of America? He says, no, not that. Read further. 1 cent? No, keep reading. What's next? In God we trust. Yes, he said. And she was like, and? And here's what he said to her. And if I trust in God, the name of God is holy, even on a coin. Whenever I find a coin, I see that inscription. It is written on every single United States coin, but we never seem to notice it. God drops a message right in front of me, telling me who to trust in. Who am I to pass it by? When I see a coin, I pray. I stop to see if my trust is in God at that moment. I pick the coin up as a response to God that I do trust Him, and for a short time at least, I cherish it as if it were gold. I think it is God's way of starting a conversation with me. Lucky for me, God is patient and pennies are plentiful. So let me ask you again. What are you trusting in? In those times of lack and those times of plenty, test us on different levels. And I want to read this story today against one of my favorite. And we're just going to look at it verse by verse if it's okay with you. I don't have a big fancy outline. I just want to read this verse by verse with you if we can. And we're going to pick out one big point. Okay? In John chapter 6, verse 1, after these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs, which he performed on those who were diseased. And what John is doing here, he's trying to make a clear distinction. Jesus is wrapping up his great Galilean ministry. He had done a lot of preaching and a lot of healing, and it makes a reference to that. And so this is kind of like a transition. As a matter of fact, John's going to transition very quickly into the last week or so of Jesus' life. He spends more time on Jesus' last week than any other gospel, and that's his main focus. But he's beginning to show us something about Jesus here after the miracles and after the study that we've had in the past. And what you see here in verse 2 is the great multitude followed him. Now, we don't get this in English, but here's the way it would read if we read it kind of the way it's written in Greek. And here's what it would say. The multitude followed him and kept on following him because they saw and kept on seeing all the miracles he was doing. And so it was a continuous ministry of watching Jesus work and wanting to be with that, right? How many of y'all, hey, I'm going to use some vacation time. Jesus is walking through and healing everybody sick. I can make some time. And so they were following him, and they kept on following him. And so this is a transition into that. And John, by the way, takes for granted. John was the last gospel written. Matthew, Mark, Luke have already been written. John is one of the last books written in your New Testament. He also wrote Revelation very late. And John kind of takes it for granted, it seems, that you're going to be familiar with some of the earlier teachings that we've already done over the last few weeks and months about from Matthew and Mark and Luke. And so he's coming to this place and he's going to leapfrog forward, but he's going to build on what the people have seen. All right? And so that's what he's kind of building to here. In verse 3, Jesus, he says on verse 3, went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And I want you to know that in Mark, it tells us that the reason that Jesus had even brought the guys to this place was they had come back. Remember, he had sent them out 2 by 2 and said, go out and heal and cast out devils and all that stuff. We looked at that a week or so ago. Well, they came back and they're all full of, man, we're pumped up. The demons are leaving and people are getting healed. And Jesus was like, And it tells us in one of the other Gospels that they were so pressed in by the people around. They were so crowded, they didn't even have time to eat. So Jesus says, come along with me to a secluded place so that we can get rest. The whole point, what I'm trying to make here in verse 3 is they went to that spot that day to get rest because they never seemed to have a moment. Have y'all ever just been crowded out? I mean, you just don't have any time to think, to pray, to refresh. And Jesus knows this about ministry, by the way. If you get empty, there's nothing to give your family. There's nothing to give the people around you. You're empty. And that's part of this story. They haven't had time to go shop for food. They don't even have enough for themselves. They're just trying to get away. Have y'all ever, I just want to get away. Want to get away? Love those commercials when those used to happen, because I usually identify with those people doing stupid stuff and feeling embarrassed. And so the whole point here is to get away. That's verse 3. Verse 4, now Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. And he's just telling you time. John used Passover feast as a way to tell time and where you are in time. And so verse 5, then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that they may eat? Now, by the way, these next 3 verses are really where I want to point us to this morning. This is God's message for us today. Who will we trust and how will we trust? He lifted up his eyes and saw a multitude coming toward him, and he said to Philip, where shall we get bread to feed this multitude? Now, look at the next sentence. But this he said to test him. Have y'all ever felt like you've been tested by God? Oh, God would never do that. Baloney. Have you ever read the scripture, the questions Jesus would ask people at times? Now, this says clearly in my Bible, y'all might be reading a different version, maybe a nearly inspired version or something. But my version says, Jesus said this to Philip to test him because he already knew what he was going to do. And he also knew there's nothing on this mountaintop to feed those people with. He knew what the disciples had, and it was nothing. They just got back from their vacation. Their missionary trip. And they were trying to get some vacation now. So he knows they've got nothing. Now, I want to say this to you. God knows what you got. He also knows what you don't got. And I want to say this to you when we read the story here. He never asks us for what we don't have. Are y'all out there? Oh, quit telling me. When I win the lottery, when you get struck by lightning 7 times, this is the way I come back with you. Have y'all ever done that? Just dream. Or maybe you went to the Amway convention and put the pictures on your refrigerator. Am I the only one? And you dream big, dream big. When I get rich, when I strike it on, when I hit the lottery, I'm going to do this with all the stuff. And God says, you know what? I never asked for what you might have. He knows what we don't have. He knows what we do have. And he knows they don't have anything. He knows what's up there. He said this to test Philip. Philip, you ever felt tested? Not that Philip. He's too nice a guy. So the testing of Philip is real. I'm going to say, the Lord tests all of us with this. Where are you going to get your trust for what you need? Where will you put your trust in for what you need? And by the way, Philip was from nearby Bethsaida, so he knew the land, and he knew this is like living in Panhandle. Even if we went down to Subway, they couldn't make enough sandwiches for all these people this morning. We should have called 2 weeks ahead and got some of those big 12-footers. And that wouldn't. He knows the area. It's rural. It's out on the hills. So he's testing him. He knows he's familiar with his surroundings. And Philip, by the way, also, if you do a study, was kind of the guy that was kind of the administrator. He's kind of analytical. Just think about this. Let's keep reading. Let me show you how analytical he was. This he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Look at verse 7. Philip answered him. He didn't just give a, what? He's thinking this. The wheels start turning. Jesus says, where are we going to feed them? Philip starts, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. 200 denarii, 200 days' wages, 200 days of working for daily wages couldn't feed the 5,000 just men, not including women and children, who were there that day. He figured this out in the time that Jesus, so he's analytical dude. He knows we're in trouble. Now, have y'all ever done that? You put it down, you get the ledger. I'm getting like to the second number and go, oh my goodness. And this is Philip. We hadn't even got to the part of what Jesus wants to do yet. He says this, he tests him. Philip tries to figure it out. And by the way, when Philip looks at this, he has four choices. And they say this over in Mark. Choice number 1, let's just send them home. Have you ever wanted to do that? I'm not saying this to my family who are here. But have you ever wanted, y'all can stay as long as you want, because I got to be careful with this illustration, but have you ever wanted to do that with your family? You know, it's been a while. Let's just send them. I don't know what, the grocery bin's empty. We don't know what we're going to feed them. And so the disciples in Mark, you go back and read it, I bet it was Peter that did it too. Send them home, Lord. There's nothing to eat up here. Jesus knows he's got a testimony. So that's option number one. Just ignore the problem. Have y'all ever done that with your bills and stuff? Don't say amen. I don't really want to know. I don't have enough time for confession. Send them away. Ignore it. Raise some money and go shopping. And then the question comes, where? There's nowhere around there to get what they need or enough of it. We could give a crumb out of this little boy's fishes and stuff we're going to read about in a minute to each person. And maybe that'll supernaturally fill them up. By the way, there are some theologians that actually believe that's kind of what happened. That the little boy offered his food, and then all of a sudden everybody else had lunch in their hip pockets. There are actually commentaries that believe. I'm like, if you don't believe the Bible, would you just give up and go get a real job? Huh? That's not what happened. You give it a little crumb. Or the fourth choice, we're going to have to count on God. Oh no, has it come to that? Remember they were saying one time, you know what, we're going to have to pray. You know, they've been asking for stuff, and they told the preacher, and he says, well, all I can say is we're going to have to pray. And the couple said, oh, it's come to that? Yeah, it comes to that. God gets us to that a lot of times. So that's their choices. And I want you to see, by the way, eating and drinking in Jewish culture really speaks of prosperity and plenty and blessing. That's why it's important when folks visit to feed them, wash their feet, and show hospitality, because it was a sign of the Lord's blessing, and it was part of God's pouring out in their lives. You're going to share that. And so all this spoke of, we're lacking the basic necessities, and we can't share with anybody. And so this miracle touches on the basic needs of men, eating and drinking. How many of y'all like to eat? Some of you I don't have to ask. I like to eat. I'm growing in the Lord. I'm twice the preacher I used to be. I believe in outreach. It doesn't get any better. But all these things, I believe in eating. So eating and drinking are the basic human needs. But the deeper need of John, and John always writes on two levels. It tells us when Judas betrayed Jesus, he went out and it was night. When Judas betrayed Jesus, it really was dark, wasn't it? And that's the way John writes his gospel. There's the kind of just the superficial, but underneath it is and here's what he's saying. There's a need. Eating and drinking is the human basic need, but there's a deeper need of where is your trust? Who's your provider? Who gives you life? See, eating and drinking's life. Where do you get that from? And Jesus knows that he is superior to man's need. This is the Messiah, not just a prophet. This is the kind of miracle the Messiah is supposed to do, not just a prophet. And if you just kind of casually read it, well, it's just another miracle. No, this is messianic. This is who you've been waiting for thousands of years. He's here on the mountaintop, and your stomach's growling. What's he going to do about it? He's superior to those needs. Now, look at verse 8. I know y'all are excited to get on to the story. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? Couple of things. Andrew's always bringing somebody to Jesus. He didn't know what to do with them. He just bring them to Jesus. I don't know what to do. Peter, Andrew, come see this man that he's the Messiah. Bring him to Jesus. Sometimes you don't know what to do with people. If you could just introduce them to Jesus, let him take over. So he's doing that here. He's got a little kid. Look at these loaves. And then, by the way, it tells you they're barley loaves to help you know this is a poor son. This is a poor kid. This is common, everyday, cheapest bread there was. And 2, this was a snack pack. Snack pack meal. We're not talking catfish and bass like Redneck Church. We're talking sardines and a few loaves. And so he brings him to Jesus. Oh, I love this. And you got to ask. I'm telling you what right now. A televangelist, if he did this, took that little boy's loaves and fishes, he'd be strung up today. Took the last little bit out of that little boy's mouth. Couldn't y'all hear it? But that's what, I'm going to show you something here in a minute that just I think is so cool. But he says, here, what are we going to do with all? And have you ever felt this way about your check? Have you ever felt this way about your spirituality? Have you ever felt this way about your emotional makeup? What is what I have among all the needs that I'm finding in my life? Have you ever felt that way? I have no clue how this is going to stretch that far. Have you ever felt it? What are they among so many? Jesus said, make the people sit down. Make the people sit down. Now remember, what's John's point? John's point of writing his gospel. By the way, if anybody ever knocks on your door and tells you Jesus never claimed to be God, you need to know that the whole book of John was written to prove Jesus was God. That's his purpose. That's why he starts in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. His whole purpose is to tell you Jesus is God. So John, as he's writing here, no less, I'm going to show you Jesus is God. So this is that second layer again. Look what it says. Make the people sit down. Now, in one of the other Gospels, it says there was lots of green grass there, and all the people sat down, 50s and 10s and 100s, in orderly fashion. He made them. Listen, see if it rings. See if there's anything familiar. He made them lie down on green grass. He made them sit down. You're not going to go dig up anything to eat around here. You just well sit down. Just well sit down. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He's the Lord. He's the shepherd. So here he is. He make them sit down. Now there was much grass there. Even it says in here, the men sat down in number about 5,000. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to his disciples, the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. Have y'all ever had one of those meals when everybody got a little bit, but you were still hungry and went home and scarfed out of the refrigerator afterwards because you didn't want to be rude? I'm the only one. I am the only fat pig in the building. I've done that. Just a little bit. Oh, I'm full. And I go home. Or on the way, Allsup's burritos. Let's all share in the fun. He says, man, they get all that they want. So as he does this, he gives thanks. And that word, by the way, is Eucharisto. It's where we get the word Eucharist from. It's where we get the word for the Lord's Supper from. That's why we're doing Lord's Supper today. And here's all it means. He gave thanks is what it means. Gave thanks is Eucharisto. Eucharisto. He gave thanks for the blessing of life. Bread is life. And he gave thanks and he broke it. And out of that comes miracles, supernatural miracles. So I want you to see the formula God does use. He does use a formula, and here's what it is. He takes what you got, he blesses it, sometimes he breaks it, but then he multiplies it. And I want to say this to you. God can only multiply what you've let go of. Just think about it, what you've let go of. And I'm not talking about giving to the church. Would you quit it? Oh, he's just talking about the offering. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when you saw somebody poor out on the street and God said to your heart, let go of it. Not about us. It's about just the lifestyle of it's all God's anyway. Only what he has in his hands can be broken and multiplied. Whatever you're hanging on to, well, there you go. 2 plus 2 is 4. Let me give you God's math. 2 plus 2 is 4 to you. 2 plus 2 is 2 billion to him. Don't you like that math better? So who are you trusting today? Yourself or him? Where is your trust? This is it. He gave up. Can you imagine the little boy? I was going to have breakfast in a minute. But then can you imagine the little boy when Jesus lets the basket down? And now there's bass fishes. Oh my, don't you know that was cool? Don't you know, that's my breakfast. What I just gave up is what he's just taking to multiply. Isn't that cool when God does something with stuff you had that didn't matter, but all of a sudden now it matters to everybody? He takes it, he blesses it, he distributes it. It says they were all filled, verse 12, look. So when they were all filled, he said to the disciples, gather up the fragments that remain so nothing's lost. There's stuff left over. I hate it when churches act stingy. Well, we don't want anything to go to waste. Well, don't worry, it never will around there. We don't need to be, I would rather have food left over to give to everybody else outside next week than run short because we were stingy. So don't be stingy. He says, gather up the fragments. This is the way Jesus does it. When he takes it and multiplies it, he has stuff left over. And he says, gather it up. We can give it away. Don't be stingy. So they gathered up, and verse 13, they filled 12 baskets with the fragments. That's one per disciple on purpose. Jesus wanted to make sure each disciple had their own basket. And which were the fragments, and he mentions it again, of the 5 barley holes which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had eaten and had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, this is truly the prophet who has come down to the world. They missed it again, kinda. It's part of the prophet, but it's the Messiah too. Messiah prophet, more than Moses, more than Elijah, but the prophet from above. Now I want you to see this, what Jesus does. Later on in another story, we're going to find out the disciples try to cross another sea, and they don't have anything to eat. Not too long after this. Really not. What do you think? This is just my opinion. I'm giving you my opinion. Okay? I think I know what Jesus did with the leftovers. What do y'all think he did? I think that little boy went home and said, Mama, you're not going to believe this. Because we find out later the disciples didn't have it. They weren't carrying it. They didn't have it in their boats. Never mentions it again. And I can't prove this, but I know who gave the first time. And this is the way God works. He takes what's given, then he multiplies it, and he gives it back in multitude form. So why would he give it to anybody else? I think, hey, you guys, you 12 guys, follow that little boy home. And wouldn't that be cool? Walk into the village. Hey, party at our house. My breakfast has fed an entire crowd, and we're going to party again tonight. The burritos are going further. The barbecue brisket is a 3-mealer. Y'all have done it. What are we going to have tonight? Well, we had brisket for lunch. Had some left over. How many of y'all? This is him. He takes it, he blesses it. So again, look at God takes, he blesses, he breaks, he multiplies, he gives it back for distribution. And I want to say this. This is our point this morning. Jesus is not always moved by need. Now, in this story, we find out he was moved with compassion because the multitudes were like sheep without a shepherd. So he was moved by the people's need. But that's not always the case. And he didn't move until he found out what was around. You notice that? How many of y'all think Jesus could have went? Loaves, fishes. Matter of fact, when there's something about making the stones into bread, I think I remember being tempted about doing that too. Jesus just doesn't usually do it that way. Matter of fact, I didn't see him do that. You know what he does? He takes the little to make a bunch. He multiplies what's there. It is important for you to remember that Jesus is not usually moved by need. Need is the opportunity. I know it's hard to see. Believe me, I know. Need in your life is an opportunity. Would you preach that back to me? Because I need to hear it. Need is opportunity in your life. And flat out truth, sometimes he puts us to the point where only he will be able to do it. Need is opportunity. But the miracle starts with a step of faith. A little boy that says, I'll give my lunch. Here, Jesus, you can have it. Usually it means letting go of something. Letting go of something you hold dear to have what he wants to make dear to you now. It starts with a step of faith, and it's letting go of something. What is it that you've been holding on to thinking, I've got to make this work. I've got to make it happen. I've got to make it go. I've got to make it stretch. And you're holding on so tight. I'm just going to tell you, his math's better than yours. His miracles are better than your practicality. Aren't you glad they didn't listen to Peter? Send them home. Aren't you glad they didn't listen to Philip? What's that among so many? We can't go shopping. Aren't you glad they listened to Jesus? What do you got? Give it here. Give it here. Where's your trust? He is the God who provides. And again, it's more than finances. It's just life. He's the God that provides you with friends. He's the God that provides you what you need. One day, you can put your Bible up, we're done. There you go. But don't shut down yet. Just listen one last time. There was a little boy who was selling goods door to door. Really poor boy. Was barely making it, trying to put himself through school. He found out he only had one thin dime left, which was a little bit of money in those days. It was a while back. But he was very, very hungry, and he wondered what he could do. He thought maybe I could find a meal at the next house. Maybe they'll give me a meal for a dime. However, like all guys, when he knocked on the door, a pretty girl answered, and he lost his nerve. Isn't it funny how we get to go, and he asked for water instead. Can I just have a glass of water? That's us fellas. You're not smooth as you think you are. She thought he looked hungry, so she gave him a big glass of milk instead. And so he drank it down slowly so he could enjoy her company, and also he wanted to make it last. And when he was finished, he said, "How much do I owe you?" The girl's response was, "Mama always taught us to never accept money for kindness." He said, "Then I thank you from my heart." And he went on his way and began to sell some more. As Howard Kelly, that's his name, left that house, he not only felt stronger physically, but he was encouraged in his spirit because he had just been about ready to give up. He was encouraged and had faith in people and God again. And so he continued to sell. Many years later, that same young woman became critically ill. The local doctors were baffled. They finally sent her to the big city where they called in specialists to study and try to cure her disease. But it was rare. Dr. Howard Kelly, at that time, was called in for the consultation. When he heard the name of the town she came from, a strange light filled his eyes, and immediately he rose and went down the hall to her hospital room. Dressed in his doctor gown, he went in to see her, and he recognized her instantly as the girl that had blessed him with a glass of milk years earlier. He went back to his consultation room, determined to do his best to save her life. And from that day on, he gave special attention to her case. After a long struggle, the battle was won. Dr. Kelly requested the business office to pass the final bill to him for approval. He looked at it, then wrote something on the edge, and the bill was sent back to her room. She feared to open it. Have you ever got one of those notes? You kind of save that mail for last. Let's read People in magazine instead. She feared to open it, for she was sure it'd be more than she could ever pay the rest of her life. Finally, she looked, and something caught her attention on the side of the bill. She read these words: "Paid in full by one glass of milk." It's what we let go of, not what we hang on to. Now listen to the Spirit. He guides us in those things. He guides us in those ways. See, the real question this morning is not what you got. It's what you trust. What you trust. And when we give it to Him with thanksgiving, we Eucharisto it. We give it to Him with thanksgiving, with a cheerful heart. This is what He's always said. He loves cheerfulness out of a heart. He don't like folks come up to the box or to that person on the street, "Here, I just feel guilty if I don't." Y'all ever done that? Only me again. That's why He says He likes a cheerful giver, because it comes back to who we're trusting, not what we're doing or not what we have. And so today we're going to Eucharisto. We're going to give thanks that He is our source of life. He's who we trust in, right? Not our stuff, not our name, not our fame or lack thereof. Him. Then the question always comes back: how much has He given us? When we look at these elements today, bread that's broken, that's what His body was. Now that's giving, isn't it? Blood that's been poured out, that's giving, isn't it? So we Eucharisto this morning. I had some guys I asked to help me. If you come, please. I'm going to ask you this morning to just hold on to the elements after these guys pass them out, and then I'm going to pray over them. And then we're going to partake together. We're going to Eucharisto together. We're going to give thanks together, all right? So if you just pass that among us, you can start over here, and if you'll start over on that section for me. And here, if you don't mind, Mr. Stephen. Thank you. And by the way, if you're here visiting, you believe in Jesus, you put your trust in him. If it was today or 100 years ago,